Cool. I'm calling this meeting of the Board of Education to order. Can we please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? Sorry. Thank you so much. Good evening. So happy to have you guys here with us. And most importantly, I wanted to thank Michael Joseph for this format. This was a really good idea to put us in this new shape. Although it does sort of put Dr. H, as you point out, Cody, on a little bit of a hot seat, but that's okay. So I think our first item for discussion is the strategic plan. And so I turn this over to you, to Dr. Mercanti Anthony.
Okay, so hi everybody. So the strategic plan committee, I'm excited to talk about the strategic plan because for a couple of reasons. Most importantly is because because this is the board retreat and things, it really gives us a chance to talk about teaching and learning and student achievement and all the concerns, and to think big picture about how we may be able to move the needle in those things and all these issues that are addressed in the town. You saw a little bit about, you hopefully saw the presentation that's online. And we're going to talk that I am not going to repeat the presentation because that's the point of the presentation. So a little bit about that first, and then we'll talk about the strategic plan. So as I mentioned in our last board meeting, and we've had lots of conversations, I think there's a lot of advantage to taking advantage really of modern technology to record a lot of these presentations that the board gets, be they STEM reports, other achievement reports, curriculum reports. That way the community gets to access them at their own time. The board gets to see them, the board gets to think about them, and then we can spend this time as a board and with the community having a thoughtful conversation about them. They last time, for example, instead of getting presentations at 10:30 at night, people can watch them in the comfort of their home and come in, and we can better inform public comment, better inform the community and all that. So that's my aside on the method behind my madness. So that's my marketing. You'll see there, I even on purpose, if you watch my little mouse clicker, you'll see how I recorded and paused and things like that. I did that modeling so people in the future would know how to do it. So it's very simple. So all that said, on the strategic plan itself, and then the 12-minute presentation. So the strategic plan committee met. We'll meet monthly moving forward, but the strategic plan committee met before this meeting at the beginning of the month, and the presentation speaks about a little bit of that conversation and a little bit about the plan moving forward. You have the draft timeline. The idea I would hope for this time is just, like I said, to have a conversation a little bit about and feedback from the full board around the ideas that we talked about both in the presentation and the timeline, specifically around the work moving forward. The executive summary, for anyone watching who didn't watch the presentation, the executive summary is we have a strategic plan. The strategic plan is expired in 2020. We need to reinvigorate that. We need to re-engage. However, the strategic plan has very good bones. A lot of very thoughtful people over a lot of years spent a lot of time working on the strategic plan. We have a vision of the graduate that makes a lot of sense. That the strategic plan is meant to more fully realize. And that was really the ultimate goal of any strategic plan, should be to more fully realize the vision of the graduate. What we're proposing is to spend the winter and spring in reinvigorating the strategic plan around the concept of stretch goals. So a stretch goal is a multi-year, say 5-year goal, 2 to 3 5-year goals that we would identify hopefully by the June retreat that would help ground the next iteration of the strategic plan. An example of a stretch goal would be a rather ambitious goal that at the surface isn't immediately achievable, but over time in incremental steps we get there. You see that increasingly popular around the country at different districts. Philadelphia has the stretch goal, all third graders reading on grade level. Los Angeles has a stretch goal, 100% graduation rate. So you see a lot of these type of stretch goals around the country that might seem pie in the sky, but then what we do through the strategic plan and through the work of our district leaders and administrators, we set individual annual goals that make incremental steps towards a stretch goal. And that's what we kind of laid out in that timeline. Right now, all our buildings, and that takes advantage of a lot of our existing structures, because right now all of our buildings create school improvement plans every year that have SMART goals attached to them. SMART goals meaning they're specific, measurable. What's the A? Accountable? I always forget the A. Specific, measurable, and time bound, actionable, and time bound. So specific, so with quantifiable student data attached to them. We do that every year, but currently the SMART goals are not really attached to any long-term plan. So aligning our SMART goals in our time lane that we put out in the document, basically the idea would be if we engage in a root cause analysis over the next few months, such that in our June retreat, we're able to have a draft stretch goals to talk about that can be adopted by the June business meeting. And then over the summer, our leaders, our building leaders and central office leaders, in conjunction with teachers and faculty and staff, can develop SMART goals as part of the school improvement plan as those first steps towards the 5-year stretch goal. So that's it that's the executive summary, but you see more details in there, including the literature that we're using to inform the approach. So with that, yeah, I'll defer to the board.
Mr. Kelly.
I liked your video. Thank you and Happy New Year.
Ms. Downing.
Mike, I have to tell you, I think this is I'm so happy because we kind of like, since I've been on the board, we've kind of foundered, and I feel you've set some very good goals, some stretch goals maybe for yourself, but I'm happy to see the level of detail and the thought that's gone into it. And I feel that this process with you at the helm is going to be very well executed. And I'm really pleased. I guess my one question is in terms of full board participation, between now and June, is, kind of thinking through, do you want, or maybe there's too many cooks in that because you have 3 of members on the committee. And that would just be like, because I think there was something in April when I got my glasses on about the interim report on the leadership team, like whether it warrants, I mean, we don't have to decide now, an additional board workshop, kind of something like this, just to help the process along, because I certainly am all game to help make this happen in the best possible manner. But thank you.
We've already met in the new year. Any other questions for Michael? Okay, well done. I think we also should make all agenda items strategically that long. Okay. Wait, did you have a question?
No, I didn't have
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
10 seconds. So I just wanted to say as a member of this committee, and I can't speak for Karen, but I feel like maybe she would agree with me. Our first meeting was exceptionally productive, and Mike, because I'm never going to get the full, like, Dr. MJM.
You'll get there.
MJMA. Took every bit of feedback that had been given. We had, shared stuff from the past very many years, and I think we all 3 of us were in alignment and agreement, and as well as Dr. Jones. And I'm very excited for this to be able to move forward. And I just I'm glad that others here saw all the incredible work that went into the start of this process.
Yeah, Karen, anything? Excellent. Okay, it's going to be hard to follow that. So next discussion item, Special Education Action Plan, Dr. H.
To hold it down.
So the BET today was like, you just put it down and you were done.
I know.
It was very confusing.
Hold it the entire time. Oh. I'm definitely not going to be as quick as the last presentation, so I'll pre-record. So good evening, Chairwoman Stowe, Dr. Jones, Board of Education members, parents, and community members. I'm happy to be back to share where we are on the Special Education Action Plan and to answer questions that have been coming forth since the last time I was here last month. Next slide. So in tonight's presentation, I'm going to review the following agenda items, looking at the goals and considerations of the development of the plan, update on the action plan rollout, recommendations for moving forward, and some measures for success. Okay, thank you. And in developing these agenda items, I consulted and spoke with Dr. Mercanti, Anthony, and Mrs. Hirsch on the best way to bring the information from the Special Education Action Plan to the Board of Education. So my goal is to be able to answer as many questions as possible during the presentation and then be able to answer any additional questions. Next slide. So these 28 recommendations are what came out of the PCG report that was conducted last year. So each of the 28 recommendations fall into one of 6 domains, looking at learning environment and specialized services, leadership, high expectations, human capital, systems and structures, and family and community engagement. We're on our way to meeting some of those recommendations already, and a few that we have already completed, such as updating special education transportation, updating the special education department organizational structure, which included a new name and a new logo, looking at cross-departmental collaboration and special education procedures and practices manual. We completed that, and as of Monday, we have finished training all of our administrative staff on the entire manual. And on our next Staff Wednesday, we'll do the last section with our special education staff. So I'm pleased to say that we are almost done with that. Next slide. So the recommendations from the PCG report addressed several different recommendations, from universal design for learning to multi-tiered systems of support, which support all learners in the general education classroom. As such, the goal of the implementation plan is to really ensure that all students have access to high quality educational opportunities in the general education classroom, that we're providing scientifically research-based individual interventions for individual students, which is what we call multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, and appropriate special education services and supports to make progress toward students meeting their IEP goals. So we are making sure that we want the work coming out of the special education office to result in supporting all learners, that we are looking at how our students with disabilities, without disabilities, are getting the types of instruction that they need. And that starts with the universal design for learning, which happens in your general education classroom. Dr. Marcus and myself have been working with the MTSS, and then our special education office is working on specifically the special education areas. So we really want to capitalize on the inclusive culture that has already been developed within Greenwich Public Schools, and to really look at how we are one system supporting all students. And that's one of the nice things about the PCG report, is it didn't just look at special ed, it looked at how to support all learners. Next slide. So in the development of the action plan, we looked at a variety of factors. So one of those is that all the recommendations were in alignment with the IDEA, so the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We also looked at the timing of the recommendations. So those recommendations that we could enact immediately recommendations that required additional information gathering, and recommendations that would take several years to implement. We also looked at how we needed to coordinate with some of the other Greenwich Public Schools departments. So human resources, curriculum, finance, looking at how all those factors came into play. And we looked at recommendations that impact and required training of all Greenwich Public School staff versus just the special education department. So for example, Universal Design for Learning was an initiative that required training for all of Greenwich Public School staff, whereas when we look at IEP processes and procedures, that is more specific to our special education staff. So in addition, some items were prioritized based on the need of them as the foundation in order to address other areas. So such as things like our reorganization of the special education department and our updated procedures and processes manual laid a foundation for us to then move on to other things. Other areas such as updated transportation and cross-department collaboration were systems that were easier to set up and were things that we could do right away. In each domain and between domains, there's an overlap of recommendations. So in designing the action plan, we looked at how things overlapped. So for example, the recommendation in domain of professional development overlaps with many of the other recommendations. In later slides, there's a visual on how we mapped out each of the domains to make sure that the work identified could be completed within the identified timeframe. Next slide. So this is the first domain, and it's the largest domain that contained the most recommendations. So Greenwich has laid the foundation for inclusion and embracing students with disabilities in general education classroom. However, we are required to have a continuum of options for students. And while we can serve many students, there are some students that require out-of-district placements or other more specialized services within the district. So time was spent looking at what current services and options are available to students. And this is what generated the program needs. And then we'll discuss some specific program needs later on in the presentation. As you can see, this learning environment and specialized services really looks at what kinds of supports and services are we offering our students in the schools, and looking at how we can redesign or do some of these better of the things that we already are doing. Next slide. So here's an example of the visual in terms of outlining the different things that are part of the recommendation. So we were able to map them and take a look to say, okay, what can we do and how does that fall across the timeline? I think visual timelines are very helpful so that not just looking at the paper, but being able to have all those out. Next slide. So the last slide started in July, and this is what we still have to do the rest of this year. But if you look at some of the activities, many of them overlap and work within each other and support each other, so that it's not necessarily doing separate work, but it's work that dovetails together. Next slide. So here's a few of the things that we have done since the beginning of the year. So we've completed the Universal Design for Learning training for administrators and all teachers. We have a multi-tiered systems of support committee and development of the MTSS manual. And that's a coordination with Dr. Marcus in the curriculum department. And we have a plan on March 25th to introduce MTSS at the district-wide PD. We've done IEP training from the State Education Resource Center for all administrators. It's part of an ongoing training that's happening this year. We've had a participation of the multidisciplinary group from curriculum and special education to the Connecticut State Department of Education disproportionality training. So we've had ELP, our EL, English language arts, as well as our special ed staff. So we're really looking at how we're bringing the curriculum department and the special education department together to be able to support our students. We've contracted with a co-teaching consultant at the middle and high school to support the teams. So middle schools had co-teaching in some of the schools for a while. The high school, it's new, and we want to make sure that we're providing high quality services to students. So we have somebody working with our teams to make sure that they're provided the support that they need in order to do it effectively. We also have a high school academic lab redesign team right now. We have approximately 6 teachers from the high school and myself and Christina Dawson, who is the special education coordinator, working with the team to look at how we can redesign the academic lab to support the students better. We really wanted to hear from the teachers where they saw their challenges to be able to help redesign to help them help their students. And they've given lots of great ideas. We've also hired a 0.5 assistive technology specialist. So technology is really important in having our students help access the curriculum, as well as accessing higher level courses. So often being able to dictate or having something read to them, it's not that students necessarily can't understand the material, it's the access. And so Megan White has been working with our elementary, middle, and high school teachers, as well as some of our paraprofessionals, and helping them be able to work with students for access. And we've also updated our transportation procedure to make it run more smoothly and to make sure that when students are requiring transportation, we're able to get that set up in a reasonable time. Next slide. So the second domain included leadership. And so that, we want to look at how we're supporting our students with disabilities and coordinating efforts with community organizations to improve results. So again, next slide. We mapped out what it was that we needed to do, and you can see that we had a lot of work that we were able to do at the beginning of the school year in regards to reorganization of the district and working with other departments. And then you see, it's not that we're not working on anything during the rest of the year, but that's where it helped map out for us, not trying to do too much at once. And looking at in June, we're coming back to some of those activities as we start to plan for next year. Next slide. So some of the things, as I mentioned, we updated our department organizational structure, our collaboration, and also looking at special education professional development for our special education administrators. As we were asking our special education coordinators to go out into the schools and into the classrooms, we want to make sure that we're all calibrated in what we're looking at, that we're looking for those, that high quality teaching and those expectations for our students. And so we participated in CASE, which is the Council of Administrators for Special Education, in several trainings in looking at how to assess high quality education for students with disabilities. And we did that as a webinar, as a group for several sessions. And I think, making sure everybody's together and, we are all supporting the same vision is really important. Next slide. So the next domain was high expectations, looking at academic optimism and growth mindset, elevating rigor, and measuring instructional practices and beliefs. Next slide. A lot of the work that we're doing in this domain is starting now in the spring. So this is one of those domains that we really needed to set some foundational pieces before we could go further in looking at some of the classes, looking at calibrating what are we looking for, how are we ensuring that students are getting that instruction. Next slide. So we have the assistive technology training for staff and students to assist students in accessing on-level and advanced coursework. So again, we want to make sure our students have the ability to access that. We're working with the high school and reviewing placement guidelines for high school courses. So we've talked about how do students get into different classes and what is it that we need to look at. I've met with Mr. Mayo as well as some other members of the high school team, and that's been communicated to the middle school. So as we look at how we're transitioning our 8th graders into 9th grade, we're really looking at, okay, how can we ensure that all of our students are being placed in the most appropriate classroom and given having those high expectations and assuming competence and assuming that they can do the work, which is very important. We're also developing a walkthrough protocol to assess the universal design for learning, and that students with disabilities are being provided access to appropriate accommodations and grade level curriculum. So again, it's that calibration of what are we looking for when we go into a classroom? How is it that we know that these things are happening? And then being able to go, as we outlined in the timeline in the spring, it's as we go out now, we can then start meeting with principals and other building leaders to talk about what are the school specific things we need to do to support them. Next slide. So professional development is a big one. We've done a lot of professional development this year, both district-wide and at some individual levels. If you can just skip 2 slides. So we have been training in assistive technology. We've been training in co-teaching. For our middle school staff, we did training in DBT for our mental health staff, which is dialectical behavior training, which is, helping our students, especially as they're coming back with some of the mental health issues. We've done some Ross Green training for some behavior support. We've really been looking at assessment and evaluation, including the assessment of our Twice Exceptional, our 2E students. We had a training with our school psychologists on what to look for. We've been doing training on bicultural and bilingual assessments. So how do we assess our students who come from various backgrounds, as well as how are we assessing for dyslexia and reading disabilities? We've also been doing professional development on school refusal strategies, because as we've had a challenge of students coming back from COVID, we put together a school refusal team and coming up with a school refusal protocol that we're in the final stages of development with, so that we can really have something in place the goal is to intervene early. 2 days, you're like, we need to follow up. We can't let it go on. And so we've really been looking at that school refusal. And we have some really big upcoming PD activities as well. So as I mentioned before, on our March 25th, we'll be doing our MTSS kickoff and talking about the updated manual and the updated intervention process. We also are starting our reading instruction. So we're using Linda Mubel's Visualize and Verbalize. You'll hear it referred to as V&V often. Training for all of our elementary and middle school special education teachers and speech and language pathologists, so that we know that every special education teacher has at least one tool to be able to teach reading to our students. Next. So our systems and structures, going back to our policies and procedures manual that we updated using the state template, transparent staffing allocation model, and added district placement data. If you want to skip 2 slides, I don't think you guys want me to show you the waterfall each time. I think it's good for you to have as part of the PowerPoint, but I don't know. So as I shared before, we have our updated procedures and practices manual. The state had a template that we used. We had various stakeholders back in August meet with each section. So we sectioned the manual out into various chapters and had special education staff, administrators, teachers, parents, and it was facilitated by a state representative as well as the Special Education Resource Center representative, and they facilitated those groups. And we took the template and we made it for Greenwich. So we took what our practices were, merged them with what the law requires us to do, and had a manual. And so we're almost done, as I shared before, in the training. And then we'll, as soon as we're done with training the staff, we'll do a abbreviated training for parents. So to train the staff on the full manual is probably, when we're done, we'll have taken about 4 hours. So we'll do a shorter one for parents and make it a little bit more easier to understand than some of the legal stuff that we're doing. We're also doing out-of-district student monitoring. So each week, I meet with our program administrators who supervise the out-of-district students. And we look at what students are, currently out of district, how are they doing? We look at any students that are potentially require an out of district placement, so that it's not just about supporting the students who are in the Greenwich schools, it's supporting our Greenwich students who might be in another school. We still want to make sure that we're connected to them. We also are having school-based meetings to discuss the staffing needs for 2022-23. We've started a allocation model that we're working with the staff through. We just started these meetings this week. And so we've been meeting and talking about what our caseload is and, what our targets are for our caseloads with the building administrators as we talk about staffing. So as we work through that and finalize that, that would be something that would be shared. Right now. It's in draft and we're working through it, making sure it works. Next slide. I think one of the more important domains is our family and community engagement, and really making sure that we are staying connected with our families. Number 24 of this was enact the report recommendations. And I think that comes from that this report was really called for from the families and from the community, saying, please come and look and give us some input. And so when you look at which domain it falls into, that I think is why it's in this particular section, is because it really, there's an accountability part of that, which is why we have the action plan. And while the plan is posted and it really is more of a school district driven document, we do want to keep that as a transparency so that people know what we're working on and the progress that we're making toward all of these recommendations. 2 slides. So some of the things that we're doing is we're continuing with SEAC, and we have our SES PTAC. And I want to thank the SES and PTAC and SEAC members that are here, coming out. We also have our communication. So I've been sending out a bi-weekly some more from the department, introducing some of our district staff that people might not know, shared pictures of all of the PD that we did at the last one, as well as pictures of what we're seeing out in the schools. It's been great to, take pictures and share what students are doing, what staff are doing out at the schools, and being able to share that with the community. We've also done several parent trainings as well. We did a bullying training. Ms. Nadell and myself did a workshop on 504s. Dr. Boy and Dr. Boy have been doing a parent training series on effective ways to foster independence and responsibility in children. So really trying to keep that engagement. We're also working with the enrichment committee as part of SEAC to do some additional parent trainings, and we're, I sent a survey out, they sent a survey out, we're looking at those results and we're prioritizing what parents are asking for in terms of what it is that they would like to have more support on. Next slide. So this year really was about setting a foundation, setting a common understanding, setting out policies and procedures, making sure that, we are all in alignment of what it is that we're doing and how we're moving forward. And then in 2022-23 is looking at more school-based implementation. So, it's great. We've done our UDL training as a district, but now it's working with individual schools, because we can't forget that each school is unique and each school has its own flavor. And so while we want to keep consistency, because that's really important, we can't have different rules for different people, but at the same time, we can have a single process that can then be worked with each school. Next slide. So the creation and the expansion of specialized programs are not only beneficial to our special education students, but beneficial to all students. And so when we look at some of our program needs, we're really looking at a continuum of least restrictive options. And we're looking at many of these can help other students that are in the classroom. So when we talk about co-teaching, as I said, we've had it in middle school. There's some elementary schools with pockets here and there. But with having 2 teachers in a classroom really helps all the students in the classroom, not just the special education students, but the general education students as well. And the research behind academic growth in co-teaching classrooms really supports that that is a really valuable model that can help students. We're also looking at the possibility of implementing the unique learner program at an upper elementary. And it's been asked why Greenwich would need a unique learner program. So for some of our students with more significant disabilities, which include all categories of eligibility. So that could be a student with autism, it could be a student with intellectual disability. The identifier does not drive the IEP. So we often have students with various disability categories that still require similar services. But these students, the only option for them right now is the general education classroom with some extensive pullout services or an out of district placement. So this program specifically designs for students who are on the Connecticut Alternative Assessment Standards. And there's actually state guidance that set the criteria of who those students are. So many parents have expressed their desire to have their child attend a school within the district so that they can be with other students within the town, as opposed to being on a long bus ride and not being able to develop relationships with the other children who live in the area. In addition, these schools are all special education schools, and students do not necessarily have access to general education peers. There's always going to be a need for some students to require an out of district placement. So there, we take all, we're a public school, everybody can come to us, but some of our students with very low incidence disabilities would still need that support. But for students who can and would like to attend, we want to be able to offer them a continuum of options. And so that might be adding an additional program. In addition, there's a fiscal benefit, whereas the class is 1 teacher with 2 paras. If you looked at a typical out of district placement, it would be about a student and a half to 2 students, whereas we're looking at a program that could serve 10 to 12 students. We're also looking, in addition, so again, we're looking at continuums as an inclusion specialist for program support, because we do have a number of students that the least restrictive environment is the general education classroom, and we want to support them as well. But some of our teachers need support in what that looks like. So how do we design a curriculum, and how do we support them in the general education classroom? We're also looking at repurposing a position of a reading lab teacher for critical cases. So we had a position that was doing a lot of training, but we want to look at that, we're looking at converting that to be able to provide direct instruction to students, and then maybe some intensive training or support to then help the special education teachers to transition. So, when they no longer need that service. Again, looking at the academic redesign, again, what is the continuum of options, and how do we support the students and what's happening in the academic lab? But in addition to those large program needs that are district-wide, it's really looking at how are we providing that school-based support that I mentioned before. So universal design for learning, the interventions through MTSS, how we're having high expectations for all students in the schools, and looking at our staffing model allocation. So those are all school-based things that we want to make sure we're supporting our schools. Next slide. We also want to continue our collaboration with families. So our CF, our SES PTAC, our 2E PTAC, the parent coffees that are occurring. It's so important to keep that collaboration going, as well as communication. Communication. We want to make sure we'll keep the department newsletter. We've been updating the department website with resources, and to continue the parent workshops. So we want to make sure that we're all, again, working collaboratively as a team. Next slide. So it's important to be able to measure success of the implementation plan. Well, certain recommendations won't have specific metrics to measure success. I did develop 6 goals that incorporate the recommendations to ensure that we increase outcomes for students in the areas of identification, timely identification of service, student achievement, program options, access to high-level coursework, and collaboration between Greenwich Public Schools and families. Those 6 areas really look at the domains and the recommendations and turn them into some measurable goals so that we can look at where we are now and where we're going to be in 3 years. Next slide. So the first goal is looking at that Greenwich Public Schools will meet the state targets for state performance plan, indicator 9 and 10 related to the identification and disproportionality. So right now we have students, we are over identification or disproportionate in identifying certain categories of students. So part of working with staff in the evaluation process and working on our bicultural and bilingual evaluations is to make sure that we are identifying students correctly. So we want to make sure that students who qualify for special education, that it is a learning need and not necessarily a language difference. So we've been working with our teams on that. Number 2 is looking at students with IEPs will demonstrate growth targets towards standards for English language arts and mathematics, because achievement is important and we want our students to achieve. So looking at where we are for our baseline and then looking at the different things that we're doing, such as working with reading, looking at the different service models, all of those things should then be, we should see growth within our students. So again, it's not a specific recommendation, but that should be the outcome that we see as part of what we're doing. Next slide. So we also want to make sure that our initial referrals for special education will be completed within the 45-day timeline. So we have 45 days from the date of referral to the implementation of an IEP if a student qualifies. This is really important because we want to make sure that we are getting our student services as soon as we know that they are eligible for those services. We want to be able to offer a continuum of program options for students with disabilities. Be making sure that we have services that different students with different needs can access and that we can provide that. We also want, for number 5, is that we will increase the access of students with disabilities to participating in advanced placement, honors, or who are identified as twice exceptional. So again, we want to make sure that just because a student is identified as having a disability, that they don't have access, they don't lose access to those other options that are available to them. And so looking at assistive technology, making sure our school psychologists know what to look for when completing some of the evaluations. Those are all different things that contribute to the success of that goal. And then finally, that GPS will increase effective parent communication. So again, I think communication and partnership is what's really going to help us move forward as we put this action plan into place, and making sure that we're working together and that parents have information on their student as well as what's happening within the Greenwich Public Schools. Next slide. Because really the motto that we have gone with this year is that together we can. So it's not one person or one entity, but it's together that will make this work for our students. Thank you.
And congratulations on now being our full-time
Thank you.
head of special education. So thank you. Open it up to questions. Mr. Kelly.
Well, I guess I'll start. Whoops. I usually don't ask questions that I don't know the answer to. So I'm taking a little chance here. And the question is not basically to you. The question is to our wonderful special ed parents who have supported us all the way along and helped us implement change. Is the change we've implemented, do we get a thumbs up, thumbs down, or eh? What do you think?
It's a very good political answer. Ms. Costa.
How do I turn this off so that I can just push the button? So it's not, yeah.
So I know I emailed you with a list of questions and you were kind enough to answer them very quickly. And then I thought of a whole bunch more. I guess, is your unique learner program specific to a certain type of student with disabilities? In other words, are we looking at children with autism? Are we looking at children with dyslexia? You know, what is the catchment that you are looking to target here, or that you're hoping for uptake from?
So the program, when we look at the Connecticut Alternative Assessment Standards, so a student with any disability can fall into that, but there's a specific criteria that the state looks at. So these are students who are not on the regular state standards. They actually have an alternative standards path that they're working on. So it could be a student with autism. It could be a student that qualifies under other health impaired, but it's meeting the state guidelines that they're working on an alternate curriculum. And so that's why we would be looking at not having them in the general education classroom, because they're not working on those standards. They actually are working on a different set of standards.
Well, then that begs the question, what are we doing for, say, children with dyslexia? Because I know we have Wilson's and that's the staff members who are trained in it, I believe, are only K1 and 2. Is that true, or have we expanded the training for teachers so they're able to meet the needs of students with dyslexia?
So we have teachers trained at all grade levels with Wilson, but as I mentioned, so Visualize and Verbalize, which is an Orton Gillingham based reading program, all of our kindergarten through 8th grade special education teachers will be trained in that, as well as one of the positions that we're switching is that reading lab teacher that will be able to really help with students who have significant dyslexia or significant reading disability.
So, but 0.5 person for that, how are they going to get to all the schools?
It's a 1.0, it's a 1.0 position.
I thought I saw 0.5 for the reading
That's
specialist.
That's the assistive technology
Oh,
specialist.
sorry, my mistake. And then the other, I just have a couple others. I know that in the beginning of the year, there were some staff openings, specifically speech therapists, you know, maybe OTs. Are there any staff openings that are currently preventing children from getting needed services?
We have a couple maternity leaves or short-term FMLA leaves that we are looking at other staff covering while they're out. We do have, we've posted for a preschool vacancy. We have a teacher who is leaving to take another position. But comparatively across Fairfield County as well as the state, we have very few vacancies. So we have a very stable staff here, which is really excellent. And we have been able to, for the most part, fill vacancies very quickly because special education is a high needs. Temporary positions, 6-8 weeks positions are very, very challenging to fill.
And the other thing I just want, you know, to state for the record, I did ask about extracurricular activities for students with disabilities because there really aren't very many. So I think it's one of the omissions in the report because we want all of our students to have a well-rounded experience, including extracurriculars. So I just wanted to be sure I mentioned that in an open forum. That is something that I think we really need to pay more attention to.
Ms. Hirsch?
First of all, thank you for addressing a lot of the questions and concerns. I think that Mike and I came to you asking to make sure that we're covered tonight. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'll start specifically, I guess, with professional development, because as you said, that is probably the one that covers so many of the different domains. So, you know, I know that we have a 3-year professional development plan differentiated by role, experience, and different needs. So I know you're looking to, you know, conduct numerous training programs all within, you know, different year, but What are the plans specifically for professional development going forward? So, what areas sort of are we focusing on for that? For instance, I know that we have some very specific trainings for those, you were talking about V&V, we're talking about MTSS, UDL for, but are we also looking at behavioral training? Are we looking at procedural and legal training for all of our staff, as well as identification or academic support? So I don't know what your plans are for that, some of those areas for the next 3 years. You may not be able to answer that tonight, but what professional development will be for special education staff specifically versus all of our staff. One of the big issues that we'd heard consistently from parents is the need for all of our gen ed teachers to have, support in behavioral training for all students in classrooms. And I know specifically with COVID, we're seeing, incidences, not just here, nationwide with students in those areas.
So there's still a lot of professional development to do. And it's one of those, we need to continue professional development. It never stops. You want to make sure that even when you're trained in something that you have continuous refreshers for certain things. When we talk about like IEPs, IEP training, so starting on July 1, there's actually going to be a new IEP system that we have for the state. So every teacher, all of our special education staff is going to be going through a training for that for next year. We have as administrators, we're doing a training now. I think it's 8 weeks. And to kind of refresh IDEA and how that plays into the new system. And then this summer, there is a trainer of trainers for the new system, as well as then we will start training all of the staff. So those are one of those things that's going to be ongoing and will be ongoing for several years, because next year is going to be the first year we're using this. And so, it's a little bit of building the airplane in the air because we don't get access to the new system till July 1 when it comes online. And the training doesn't start from the state until July 1 for the new IEPs. Yes. So, we're going to be doing a lot of training and follow up with that. So that will be one of those priorities for next year, because we all want to make sure that we have accurate IEPs and that we know how to work the system.
So I was going to say, I assumed you might not have an entire course catalog per se of professional development and who it's going to, but at some point I would really love to get a little more information on that. Like I said, specifically for what our general education teachers are going to be getting as what, in comparison, because I know that was something that was a big one that had been issue that had sort of been brought up. And so along the same thing, I know, we've gone from 0.5 to we're in our next budget cycle looking to do 1.0 FTE for social workers at our elementary schools, which is something we have been asking for years. Thank gosh, very, very happy. I'm also looking to sort of see what we're going to be doing in for that kind of support at the middle and high schools, as again, we know that that's something that has been discussed, some of the behavioral concerns, and it'll sort of help those students sort of access some of the higher level courses, things like that. So I don't know what other supports we're putting in that area at the middle and high school levels too.
So the middle and high schools do already have social workers. So the social workers being added are just at the elementary only because those schools have it. So this year at the middle school, we looked at the DBT training, which is really to help them support the mental health needs of our students. So we were able to train the social worker, school psychologist, and at least one of the school counselors in that. We'll be looking at continuing that for the other middle school staff that wasn't able to do it, as well as to moving on to our high school staff. So the the DBT is it's a counseling methodology, and it's helps students think about the behaviors. It's a metacognitive, like, let's learn how to think about thinking and think about why I'm acting this way. And so it's a well-researched method, and we were lucky to be able to have our staff participate in that. And so it's continuing that. And so part of the 3-year plan is when you have a specific day of a training, we can't pull all of our mental health staff and say, okay, there's no mental health staff available today. So part of that 3-year plan is ensuring that, you know, not everybody can be trained at the same time, but keeping track of who are you training in what order, and making some sense of, okay, so we focused on the middle school and made sure everybody was doing it. So maybe at the high school next year, it's, okay, we need to focus on these houses, or maybe just these social workers. I'm just giving examples, so I don't want anybody to say, I want my house. But I think it's being systematic in how we're doing the training. And it's also the follow-up. It doesn't matter. We can train in a million things, but if nobody is following up to ensure that we're using the things that we're training on, then the training wasn't very useful. And so it's also making sure that our staff knows, you know, what it is that, what the expectations are. So even for the visualize and verbalize, you know, we've worked with the company. So Linda Mood Bell, they're going to do a mini update with our administrators on, if you go into a classroom and you see this, this is what you're supposed to see. Because if people don't know what we're evaluating, then that's a problem. So that's all part of that 3-year plan is, you know, not necessarily, these are all the things we're going to do, but how are we building, since we can't do everything at once.
So are you doing, I'll just ask, exit surveys per se, or asking for feedback from staff once they've had this training to see if it's met their needs, or they feel that they need follow-up, so that they feel that they've been successful in learning what they need to learn?
So one of the nice things is, so the way we were able to purchase our seats is that we actually get the ongoing follow-up from the company. So there's a, you know, so again, in looking at how you're planning your PD, I could be like, over 3 years, you're going to do it. And then, you know, you register everybody separately. But when you go to a company and you say, I want to register 67 people, you know, you get a discount, which is very nice, as well as you do get those little perks of, okay, we'll come and talk to your administrators. We're going to give you the follow-up and the access to the consultant at any time. And so those are the things we're looking at as we're doing that planning.
I'll ask one last question, and then I'll hand it to someone else. One of the other things that I didn't notice that we just in the report discussed today, that was something that I know that came up consistently through the audit process. And I, remember reading through the audit and seeing it, and there was support for students who exit our program, right? So there's a, we talk about the continuum of I can't even speak tonight, continuum of services. So we have students who are, it's amazing. We love to see our students exit our program and not need those deep in-depth, needs where they have pullouts, but those are still students that struggle when they get back to the regular classroom. We don't want to see them slide backwards. We don't want to see them end up right back into special ed. So are we looking to add anything for students who sort of support that, the special education program, so we don't see them regress? Will we be building in, check-in points or any kind of interim plan to just make sure that these students are, still getting what they need in the general ed classroom, even though they don't have that added support?
So that's part of what universal design for learning is, looking at how are we providing those accommodations and supports for students. You don't have to have a disability to, be provided that. Universal design for learning isn't just about students who are struggling, it's about our students who are advanced as well. And so it's looking at how are we supporting the needs for all learners. So as we build that and support that, that's part of being able to support our students when they do exit special education. So while they may not, require the specialized instruction, the basic accommodations and basic, universal design for learning talks about how do we make sure we allow students the ability to show us what they know in the best way that they know how to show us. And while that might have been an accommodation in the IEP, that's something that the classroom teacher can do. So as we move forward with that, that'll definitely help support our students, as well as our MTSS process and our interventions, because sometimes it's not just the academic, it's also the SEL that might be impacting them. And so I did want to touch on something that you said about supporting, our students and behaviors and teachers. One of the things that, and in the reorganization of the department with our behavior team, is we kind of divided the team into like a proactive in terms of positive behavior supports and mindfulness, going out and working with schools on how to be proactive in supporting students, as well as we still have our BCBAs who are providing all of that support. So before, everybody did a little bit of everything. And so now we've looked at really separating that to identify within their jobs. And so they're out at the schools helping to provide lessons with the general education teachers. They're in the classrooms and they're helping to provide that support to the schools. So we definitely wanted to put that in there. So we are providing that.
Thank you.
Ms. Kowalski, I think you're next, right?
Sure. So with respect to the prioritization of how you've come up with the 28, what are we calling them? Sorry, recommendations, sorry. With respect to the 28 recommendations, how did you decide on a priority of what would happen and when it would happen?
So some of the recommendations were really foundational. So for example, the restructure of the special education department, I think, was one of the key things in order to move forward with all of the other recommendations. So making sure that, the structure was set so that, people knew what their job responsibilities were, what they were in charge of, I think was very key. So then it was, as we started looking at the recommendations and looking at the steps, we didn't do the timelines until after we started looking at what those steps were. And that's where we started to see the correlation and the overlap of how they fit together. So like the universal design for learning is one of the key things. What happens in the general education classroom is what happens first. And then we look at MTSS as the intervention on that. So, as we roll out to all of our staff, we start with the universal design, and then it's now let's look at that intervention piece. So we really looked at what needed to be there before the next piece. And that's where the graphic was very helpful in looking at, okay, then what is the timeline in trying to get some of this done so that it's enough. So it was a quick pace because, these are our students and we want to make this change and we want to move forward, but yet not so fast that we wouldn't be able to meet the targets that we have.
So I was really excited to see the metrics that you put on the back. That has been one of my key asks, I think, along the way, is how are we going to take the work that PCG did and the active involvement of our parent community and figure out what changes, whether or not the changes that we're making are actually making a difference. So I do appreciate that some things have more difficult to put a metric around than others, but I think you've done a good job in trying to assess what those metrics should be. And I'm curious on with respect to number 2 on those grades, 3 through 8 ELA, and you have I think that's the baseline. That's currently where we're at with respect to numbers, that only 36.09% are meeting the expectations, the grade level expectations from 3 through 8. Is there a reason why 9 and 10 isn't here? I might be missing it. It says 3 through 8 and then 11. And so 9 through 10 and 12 isn't here.
So I pulled that. So we get for lack of a better term, a special education report card every year that tells us, it identifies specific targets that the district needs to meet. Those are the grade levels, the bands that the state looks at are we on target of meeting our needs? So we're actually assessed by the state in those specific grade levels and grade areas. So that's why those were pulled. because it's consistent data that the state is looking at as a benchmark. So, as we might use different metrics within the district, I knew that would be something consistent, and trying to project in 3 years, making sure that what's being measured is consistent over time. Yeah, so. Yeah. Oh, so as well as, so in 11, so grade 11 is the only high school grade that there's testing. Just,
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Okay, thank you. Well, that's helpful.
that would have been a much easier answer.
That would have
but-
been a much easier answer. Okay, with respect to the metrics, how did you come? So I realize that you have 5% in grades 3 through 8 for math. At 11, you have 5% increase, and grade 11 math, you have 5% increase, but you have an 8% increase for ELA in grades 3 through 8. So why not remain consistent?
I got to pull out my bigger PowerPoint because I can't read the small.
I was struggling too. Yeah, you have 36% and then you go to 44%. And then the others are 28 to 33, 43 to 48, 15 to 20. So I'm just curious, maybe it's a typo. But I'm curious as to why it's 5% and not 10%, or how did you come up with that as being the basis to get to seeing, and that would be the metric you want to achieve?
They should all be a 5% increase.
That's what I thought, but so, okay, so it's 5%. Fine, not a big deal. Then my question is, why 5%? Why is that going, why 5% over the course of, I think you said 3 years? Although that's, I guess it's full school years, you count 22, 23, 24. Got it.
Correct. So we set that up at, so when I set the target, it was for September of 2024. So knowing that we're also coming, so I wanted a target that was ambitious, because we don't want to just go up a percentage or two, but at the same time also identifying that we have students who are coming back off of COVID and struggling. And so trying to balance the ambitiousness as well as the realistic of the goal. And so thank you for catching my math error. So
Well, I'm just glad it's yours and not mine. Sorry. I needed to laugh. Today has been a tough day. Okay, so I want to get into a little bit of this unique learner program, and let me start off by saying that my questions, while they may sound challenging, I'm not necessarily saying that the unique learner program is not the right program. I just like to understand how it came to be, and here's my overall arching concerns with respect. So first of all, this unique learner program is something new to the board. The board doesn't know really anything about it, and we haven't approved it. And I'm not saying we wouldn't approve it. I'm just worried that we're taking things out of sequence and step, that the board, it would need to come to the board and the board would need to approve it. I believe that's how it would be with respect to policy. And that hasn't happened here. And one, it's not a criticism.
Sorry, it wasn't the budget, just as a point of order, correction. I just want to point that out. So we did approve it by approving it in the budget.
We didn't improve the content or the program itself, and
Well, you approved the budget and maybe you didn't, but that's just my back. But go ahead. Sorry, keep going.
so I guess one of the things I'd like to understand about this particular program is how many kids do we intend to serve? What are the dynamics around it? How do we view how expensive would this particular program be going forward versus the cost savings that we would get with respect to not sending kids out placement? And I know you made the comment that parents spoke that they'd rather have their children within the district as opposed to out placements. I'm not challenging that. What I'm saying is, what is the cost benefit analysis of that? And is it an additional cost to the district, or is it actually going to turn out to be a cost saving?
So there is an initial cost of hiring the teacher and the staff. However, there is a cost benefit to the district. And I do believe in one of the budget questions prior to the presentation, it's a question and actually has the exact figures. So I can't give those to you right now, but I know that there is a document that has those. So if you think that an average out of district placement costs $106,000, right? And that doesn't include the transportation cost. So if we were able to not send 10 students out, so some of this is not sending out in the future and some of it is bringing students back. But if you looked at 10 students at $106,000 each, that's about $1 million. So with the class, I'd say a teacher, a high end would be 100,000 and a paras, so would be an extra 50. So for sending the same students out of district would be $1 million. Educating them in the district just for staff is 150,000.
But how does it work? Because I would assume that your 10 students are not all going to be at the same school. So they would be, you might have one at Western, one at Eastern, one at North Street. And how is the staff in the classroom going to work with respect to that program for those students that are spread out across the district?
So the students would all be going into one school. So we would build one program, so one classroom. And so the benefit for the students is they may not be able to stay at their home school, but they're not going to an out-of-district school where they don't have access to general education peers. They're not remotely close to Greenwich. They still are part of a general education school. They have access to the specials, to lunch with their peers. It just wouldn't be at their home school. So it would be a draw from other schools.
Is that what parents have asked for in the sense of being in a peer school in the town of Greenwich versus say going to school in their community school with a sibling?
Correct, because if they were able to do school at their community school, they might still be there. And instead, and I'm picking a random school, but let's just say CES in Trumbull. There's students who are getting on a bus and, in the morning, they're going 45 minutes to an hour to go up there. And there could be not another student in the classroom that's from the other area. And then they're coming back at the end of the day, as opposed to, again, making schools up. My home school is North Street and I'm going to Cos Cob. I'm still in my town of Greenwich. I would see my peers at community events and still be part of the community.
So which school within the district do we think that we're going to house this program?
We're still looking at different options. We're evaluating what would make the most sense. So there's lots of factors in looking at that space, centralized location, who might already have a number of students who might, be appropriate for the program. So we're still looking at that.
And then how would it work with respect to different age children? So let's say, for example, hypothetically, you put it at Parkway, right? Parkway has more room, probably more space than any other school. So let's say it's Parkway. And that works really well for your elementary age school kids. And I don't know if this program is intended to cover elementary, middle, and high school, but would it be appropriate for a high school student to be attending an elementary school for the program, or do we intend to divide it by age group?
So what we're proposing is only a 3rd, 4th, 5th grade class, so that you're only looking at that upper elementary. The middle and high school classes have programs and supports that are somewhat in alignment to what we're talking about. So like at the middle school, we do have classes that some of these, like this type of student would be in. The difference is that they have the different periods, and so they go to different classes during the day, but they are grouped similar at the middle school, as well as we have something similar at the high school.
Okay, and so for those kids that might have an IEP that are outplaced prior to third, fourth, and fifth grade, would we be bringing them back?
So in looking at an analysis of our out-of-district placements, we really don't have students who are outplaced in the primary grades, the kindergarten, first, second grade. It's really when we start getting into the third, fourth, and fifth grade that are some of our students. And again, I want to say this is not for every student. This is for a very, very small population of students. So we have some students with significant disabilities who the general education class is the appropriate placement for them. But we do have a group of students that's not the appropriate placement. And third, fourth, and fifth grade is about the time where the difficulties become, where when we look at programming, where right now the only other option is an out-of-district placement.
Okay, I appreciate that. And as to the approval and the point of order made, I just think it's bad process, and I don't think it's proper process to bring it up as an approval through a budget without having an opportunity to have this kind of discourse in order to ask questions and get responses, and rather than slipping it into a budget as a line item and having it done as part of the operational budget, or if it was part of an ESSER fund. I think the proper process is to bring the program to the board, have the board be able to vet it, ask questions, be comfortable with it, and vote on it as an individual basis before it ends up into the budget, where it is a massive approval for an entire budget for a school year. I just think that was improper process.
Ms. Downey?
I was going to ask about the unique learner, but just to your point, Karen, I think because we budget so early in the school year, it was discussed that it was a placeholder item when we discussed it as a board, that this was what we think we want to do. And to the extent it wasn't going to come to fruition, we would have removed it from the budget. So I actually don't have a problem with the process, only because our timing sequence of when we vote on things budgetarily doesn't always align with when we could have made decisions and get this presentation.
But I understand that, but on that point though, it's a matter of, I'm fine with reserving it as a line item to say we could do it, but to only get the information and have this opportunity to speak and ask these questions after the budget's approved, I think that is the improper process. And it would have been more helpful to be able to meet in advance, ask the questions, and understand what we're putting a line item for to before approval and approve the program. I think that's
Well, I think the
proper
problem
process.
is with our colleagues in BET, this administration wasn't prepared to have this discussion in October, November. So we can agree to disagree. I just wanted to talk about timeline a little bit because when we got the sure thing,
Sure, Mr.
Joe.
Kelly.
Just to be fair, I know we talked about it in the budget committee, and I like the concept, like the idea, but if I wasn't in the budget committee, just to be fair, because transparency is much better than opaqueness. So transparency would say that if I didn't have the chance to hear about this, and all of a sudden I was told it was passed in a bigger picture thing that I did not have a chance to discuss, to be fair, we should be more transparent on all issues, not just some. So to be fair, I think we should sort of bring things up like that, even if we stick it in somewhere and just at least talk about it. So that's fair. All right.
Good point.
But it wasn't budget Q&A that we did do as a board. It wasn't just in the budget committee meeting, it was in the Q&A document that
Yeah,
Dr.
I feel like I
Jones-
really.
Yes, it
yeah,
was.
that's
So-
not-
I must have missed it.
I feel like I
So-
deeply understand.
So
it.
we're getting off
We're
topic.
getting off topic.
I
so
was
I'll
just
move-
talking more generally. So just more generally, more transparency.
I hear you. Okay, Ms.
So back to
Downey.
the timeline. When we originally got the PCG recommendations, it talked about this 3 to 5 year horizon. And I'm just, we're jumping around a little bit on timing. And I obviously this year is a planning year, and you talk about next year as an implementation year. Just kind of how do you envision, are we going to be able to fully implement things in the 22-23 year, or how do you envision the implementation process timeline? Because your little waves only went till the fall.
So the metrics that we set out are for September of 2024. So trying to look at a 3-year, because this is year one. And while certain things aren't being implemented, the planning is part of the training for that. It is a 3 to 5 year process. But I think that by year 3, we should have enough data to know that we're on the right track and that we should be seeing progress and success for our students.
Okay, great. And then just kind of on the timeline in PCG, can you just talk about what role PCG is playing in the process now? Because we have retained them on an extended basis, and just kind of what they're contributing to the process.
So PCG was involved heavily in the development of the action plan. I think I was meeting with them 5-6 hours a week for months to be able to get that done. Now they're working. They supported us in the Universal Design for Learning professional development. And so we're using them as consultants, as well as some of the things that we have in the action plan, helping to gather materials, helping to put things together, so on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. I'm done.
Michael Joseph.
So thank you, Dr. H. Appreciate everything here. I think it's worth noting a couple of things. One, you've been here 6 months. So I think, not everybody watching might not know that. So I think the amount we've done in that time is noteworthy. I think the other thing that we also have to acknowledge, and we never need to forget here, is we're talking about 3 to 5 year timeline process. Everything takes time. These are programs. We understand all that. We all also have to keep in our mind when we're talking about individual students, there's an urgency here, right? And 3 to 5 years sounds a whole lot different if you're the parent of a 5th grader with special needs. So I know we all know that, but I think it's important that we keep that urgency of those individual students at the forefront of our mind when we're thinking about these things. To that point, I love all the metrics and the goals in here, and this is good stuff. And this ties in very nicely, if I could put in a plug, with our first agenda item, because this is working towards some SMART goals that are going to be part of our strategic plan. The next step, I think, one of the next steps for us, in special ed, is to identify, what can be those metrics that we can track between now and September 2024. It can be a number of things. There should be student achievement metrics, but also things such as timeliness of evaluations, timeliness of PPT requests to meetings. There's a number of metrics that we probably need to identify and start tracking as we're implementing these things. Would you mind, I think it's important as we talk about the urgency of all this, would you mind commenting on, at a high level, obviously, some of the trends we're seeing as far as student difficulties now, and some of the issues that have been coming to fore this year?
So we're seeing some of the trends that we're seeing specifically in secondary, middle, and high school is mental health, and being able to support our students with that. We are seeing a lot of, at the elementary level, a lot of impact from COVID and accessing education. And so we are looking at an increase in the number of evaluations that we're completing. And we are, really working with our teams to make a determination of, is this COVID? Is this a learning disability? Because it is a big deal to be identified with a disability. And so we want to make sure that we're appropriately assessing students. So I think those are probably the two biggest trends, and they both come out of COVID. COVID has really impacted our students, and so as much as we're trying to get back to business as usual in terms of educating our students, there's an underlying additional layer in providing learning opportunities and supports and services for our students.
I was just going to, on that line, and then I'll turn it right back. I just wanted to give you kudos. I think most people should understand that we went into this year with a lot of outstanding IEPs that needed to, and assessments that needed to be looked at. And in the time that you've been here, you have not only caught up, but started to hand, like, the outstanding ones, all the new ones that have come in. So that alone is a small, tiny little metric that we can't really show somewhere, but I just have to say thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just so I can make two points just for us to keep aware of here. So one on the co-teaching, which bears repeating because I think it's so important, because there is when we talk about co-teaching, when we talk about supporting students in the general ed classroom, the least restrictive environment for many students, not all, but many, most. The more we can brand that around specialized instruction for students in a co-teaching environment, which I know doesn't flow off the tongue, but that's really what we're talking about, right? I worry that, because we've seen it implemented poorly around the country, I worry when we just talk about core co-teaching, we're talking very specifically about a general education teacher and a special education teacher sharing the responsibility for a class of students, such that all students in that class get the specialized attention they need. Most significantly, the specialized instruction. I know you know that. But I think the more we can put that in our communication out to the public, the better, because co-teaching is very new here in Greenwich. It's not new around the country. We're at least 10 years behind the time, which we also know, the times. But implementing it well really means explaining that it's really about a vehicle for specialized instruction, which is what special education is. It's students who need something special, something in addition. So that's the one point. The second point, which goes beyond you, that also I think we have to be mindful of. I think it's terrific how we're doing the Lyndon Mood Bell and the training there. There was a general ed component, obviously, to literacy too, that particularly in our early literacy, that I won't repeat myself from last meeting, but that it has to be part of this conversation as we're looking at how to support all and tracking the growth of all our learners and supporting them in all the components of literacy development. And that does affect MTSS, obviously. Mhm.
I was gonna say, I wanted to echo you're obviously much more well-versed in special education than any of us here on this board.
I just pretend.
And, but the co-teaching thing, I think specifically, I was surprised by the fact that we hadn't been doing that in Greenwich. My cousin had been doing that in New Jersey for, I want to say, over a decade, and she's been a special education co-teaching there. So I'm just excited because it seems to be quite effective. I know that just hearing about it a lot. Anyone? Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry, both Karens. Go ahead, Ms. Hirsch, and then I'll go back to Ms. Kolsky.
Well, I'll start with just two. I know when you were talking about the academic labs at the high school, rebranding and redesigning, which is something we have needed again for a very long time. And I'm very happy to hear that we're looking into that. I know you said you were surveying, working with some of the staff and the teachers as to what their thoughts on that are. Are you also speaking with some of the students or parents that have students or have had students in past times in the academic labs to see what their thoughts might be? Because oftentimes, I've heard from parents that, the teachers are doing an excellent job, but there are pieces that might be missing. So I just wanted to see if we're including them in those discussions as well.
So we've had discussions with the parents, but we have not included the students in that. And I think that's a great idea in getting some of that input. One of the things that we just completed as part of the group is, really trying to identify a course description, like what is supposed to happen in academic lab. And I think working with students and finding out, I'm so impressed with our teachers and their knowledge of the students, and they want to go 200% and help them. And they are like, okay, but I can't do everything. So how can we redesign to be able to support them? And so the ideas that are coming out are excellent, but I think that's a great idea to bring our students in and ask them, what's working and what's not, and include their voice in that.
So the second question, then I'll turn it back over. First of all, thank you for giving us more detail about the Unique Learner Program. I think that's something that is probably the biggest question mark in that plan that I get asked about on the regular, so I appreciate that. So one of the other things that we haven't talked about, that I think everybody knows I'm a big fan of, is Twice Exceptional. And I'm just sort of, I know you're talking about an advisory group, forming a 2E manual and all sorts of some things there. And I was just sort of wondering, you know, how that's going. I didn't, because I hadn't really seen that there, where we're looking at that, because I think we consistently talk about making sure all of our students have access to higher level courses. I saw some of those goals specifically built in here, and I think that's incredible. It's also making sure we discover those students not just having access at the high school level, but at the mid and upper elementary as well. So I just didn't know how you were addressing some of that.
So we've been looking, Dr. Jones and myself have been looking at manuals from 2E manuals from all over and looking at, what are the best practices, and, there's some really good guides out there. And so it's not about recreating the wheel. It's about how to, what is it that we need to be able to support our learners and to guide our staff in supporting those learners. And so we've been gathering some of those manuals, and we'll be putting kind of committees together. So unlike the MTSS committee, which we are writing the manual from scratch, we're more looking at how are we adapting what's already been created, because there's some really good stuff out there. And so, I'm a great cut and paster, and, and I think that, we, getting that input about what is it that our staff need to support them in supporting our 2E students.
I rarely toss my hand up to add myself to committees, haha, but I'm happy to sit on that one.
Why reinvent the wheel, though? That's a good point. Karen Klosky.
Yeah, I think this is a question for Tony. So is this in the ESSER plan, it says on the last page of what was submitted to the state, or on page 34, it says design space for specialized program for students on the autism spectrum and for students who have identified as students with intellectual disabilities. Are we talking about the same program? And is it covered both in ESSER and in our operating budget?
No, the positions Stacy's talking about tonight were actually the ones that when I presented the budget, literally in November, that were on the slides in November. What that is talking about is it's actually an enhancement to the space. And I believe that's one that also has a grant from the Alliance with the sensory space. And do you want to talk about that?
So over at COSCOB, they're creating a sensory room. And so using different grants through to help support that. So it's about $27,000 to create the room. And so out of the different budgets, we've so not only the ESSER money, but then the PTA is donating some money. There's an Alliance grant to be able to create that space for students. Sensory rooms, there's a lot of research behind helping students, not just students with disabilities, but even general education students, getting those wiggles out and allowing them, that place to, to decompress and de-stress.
So why was COSCOB school chosen over other schools?
Actually, it was an initiative just, that came from the principal.
And then it actually, the way this reads, it designs as 2 spaces. It does what you're defining as a sensory room. I see that. It says design and create spaces and materials for specialized programs, a sensory room. And then it says design space for specialized program for students on autism spectrum. Is that the same room or a different room?
It's the same. We are looking at a possible middle school sensory room as well.
Okay, because it doesn't define that as a sensory room. It defines it as something, a different type of room. It doesn't even define it as a room. I'm just curious as to what money is allocated for this and how is this, but this is different than what you're saying is the unique learner program.
Correct.
So it's just this paragraph here is, actually it's 2 paragraphs. It's just for a sensory room. It's not a room you're not designing another specialized space for autistic children.
No. I have to read it. Is that the one Anne wrote?
It's really best to look at the sheet that we gave you guys, I think maybe about a few nights ago. We tried to pull it all apart out of the application. It's a little bit easier to read and see. And that'll be the part that goes with the finance approval every month on the budget. But it's definitely much easier to see. The application's hard to read.
No, I understand that. This is what we submitted to this. This is what we submitted to the state. So I'm just curious, if this is something different, then we should probably correct it. But I'm just reading the language that we submitted to the state.
Right. Ms. Hurst?
As I say, I understand Ms. Kolsky's confusion. It sounds very disingenuous to say we're creating an autism program if that's not what's happening. However, I think it's best if maybe a lot of people don't understand that a huge part of for many students with autism, having a sensory space is a very specialized detail of many autism and other types of programs for students with different disabilities and learning needs. And so maybe that's how it ended up being titled that somewhere along the way. We couldn't come up with a title. I don't know.
I'm also wondering, based on the timing of when that was written, that could have been written before we even had the data of identifying who, where, what. And so in terms of, as Dr. Jones was saying, we've been kind of updating the grant as we get more specifics, but some of the things that were written this summer, we hadn't even started yet. And so it could have been, maybe the phrasing was wrong for now, but it was, that makes sense at the time that it was put in there.
As long as there's a way that we can figure out how to sort of correct that, because I think it's important for us to make sure that we are not suggesting that we are creating something that we're not. And also having parents with students with multiple different levels of disabilities in other areas wondering why a student with a certain diagnoses might have a specialized program versus another, which is, I think, the question I had asked when we talked about anyway, the other programs that we're working to create. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mr. Kelly?
Voting on anything.
He's kidding, which I appreciate. Do we have any other questions? Ms. Downey?
Just kind of what's our follow-up schedule for checking in with Dr. H? Just maybe, and we don't really have agenda planning on that, but I'm just like, I would like to, this is great and it's incredibly helpful information. And I just think I would like to be just sure we have another date on the calendar. That's, you don't have to answer it, just being sure.
I believe
guys, I
there
was
is.
just checking.
Sorry, I don't have it in front of me, but I believe there is.
I just go where the calendar tells me to go.
With that, Mr. Kelly, I want you. Seriously, thank you so much. Mr. Kelly, do you have anything for me?
Motion to adjourn.
Can I have a second? All in favor? Okay, that passes 8-0. Thanks so much. Have a good night. Thanks, guys, for coming.
Who said?